So hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of the public interview series that we are conducting as part of our Transformative Finance Lab. My name is Anja König and I lead our Transformative Finance initiative at EVPA. I'm here with my colleague of the Transformative Finance team, Peter, and of course our guest for today, Jonas Restle-Steinert of the impact advisory firm Adelphi and lead of the SEED Practitioner Lab on climate finance. We are actually engaging on this very open research process a little bit in an experimental way. So we haven't done this before. What we're proposing to do is just to have a 45-minute conversation between us around 45 minutes. Let's see how it goes. And then for all of you to be able to ask some questions, comment, or whatever you found was worth mentioning, whatever impressed you. So you're very welcome to join the debate. Also, please just add your name, share your name and your organization, your interest, maybe why you're attending in the chat. And if you have some questions that we should pick up, also please put them in the chat. Before I give the word to Jonas, I'd like to say a little bit more about why we're working on the Transformative Finance Lab and how this fits into our overall work program. So at EVPA, we believe that we actually need to think about new methods, new investment strategies, and also build our leadership skills to be able to address the societal challenges that we face, because these societal challenges are obviously complex, so we are intervening in complexity, and that we believe that requires somewhat new approaches. So moving away from a linear way of thinking and intervening into a more circular and emerging approaches. And our overall goal really is to make investing for impact interventions truly transformative. So last year, as some of you may know, we launched the Collab Award to give visibility to system practices in the EVPA community. And this year, we really set out to develop the Transformative Finance Lab. And the Transformative Finance Lab, we come up with this idea because we find that the financing and support solutions to address these big societal problems of these times, they are often developed and applied in a very isolated and disconnected manner. And there is really a lack of dedicated spaces that allow us to rethink finance and bring organizations together across the spectrum of capital. And so maybe you wonder, what is this Transformative Finance Lab? And actually, we don't know either. This is what we're here to find out. We know for sure it will be somewhat a facilitated space, a method to co-create financing solution for systemic challenges. We already know we would like to engage a diverse group of actors. And we know that the methods we would like to apply and use would be explorative methods that put an emphasis on collaboration, co-sensing, innovation, and these kind of innovation methods effectively. So for the Transformative Finance Lab, we partnered with one of our members, the Jacobs Foundation, to explore the possible design options for such a lab. And so this is really what we have in mind for the next couple of months, and you're really very welcome to join this conversation. This interview series is actually the first step of our of this design phase that we would like to make as collaborative as possible. And this is why we decided, rather than developing this in a hidden corner somewhere at our desks, we just conduct these interviews in a public way so that people can join, and we'll also record them so that people can come back to these interviews later on and maybe find them interested and then engage in a conversation with us around them. So you're very welcome to just approach us when you hear this message and when you maybe watch this video recording afterwards. We'll also host some design workshops. We'll have a consultation process with the Impact for Breakfast, with our Impact for Breakfast partners in end of March. And we hope to later this year that we actually launch our first prototype, Transformative Finance Lab prototype, with a focus on education sector, and to possibly next year on other thematic challenges, depending on the interest of our community. So I think we're all very curious to hear from Jonas about the Practitioner Lab for Climate Finance. So you will see on our list that we published on our website that there are a series of interviews, and we identified lab managers and experts that we thought could be interesting and relevant for the design of our Transformative Finance Lab. And the reason why we asked Jonas to join us for this conversation is that we found it was really interesting. It's one of the few lab mechanisms that focuses on finance and on funders. And also, I thought the method to develop real tangible prototypes, and while at the same time fostering peer learning and the connection between ecosystem actors is something that resonated very well with us. And overall, it's really impressive. I've known this process for a long time. I've been a huge fan of it for some time already. And I think over the years, and we'll hear more about it, you developed something like 26 different finance products that came out of this lab process. And in addition, you now also launched a policy prototype process, which I also find very, very interesting and fascinating. So Jonas, without me telling people more about the Practitioner Lab, welcome. Tell us a little bit more about what we should know about the Practitioner Labs on climate finance and how this could relate to the Transformative Finance Lab, and we can discuss more in depth after your short presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anja, and thanks a lot for inviting us for this occasion. I would actually, to put it into context, maybe I would say a few words about myself and about SEED and adelphi, just to sort of like be able to locate where the PLCF is actually sitting. So PLCF, Practitioner Labs Climate Finance. So I'm Jonas Restle-Steinert. I have been working on private sector development topics, green finance topics, and entrepreneurship for quite a few years across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, working for adelphi. And adelphi, as Anja already said in the beginning, is a mix of a consultancy and a think tank on a huge range of sustainability and climate-related topics. Among these are climate finance or green finance and climate finance, as well as entrepreneurship. And especially within the entrepreneurship work that we are doing as adelphi, we've been running one project for many, many years now. It's sort of our biggest project and the longest standing project, I think, as well, which is the so-called SEED initiative. SEED has been there for 20 years now, hosted by adelphi for about like 15 years. It's quite a long-standing project with the aim to support eco-inclusive enterprises, as we call it, across the world, and really help the development of entrepreneurship via different methodologies, a mix of financial and non-financial means, a mix of direct enterprise support measures, as well as indirect measures around it, which we call the ecosystem development. So we have these two pillars, the one pillar, enterprise support, and the other one would be the ecosystem development. Why am I talking about this? Because the Practitioner Labs Climate Finance are really part of what we would call this ecosystem development space. And with that, I would jump straight into it and explain a bit more what I mean by that. So when we work with our enterprise, when we work with eco-inclusive, so climate and socially responsible enterprises, we have realized that in our work, there's only so much what you can reach with working directly with these enterprises. And at some point, you get to a point where you realize, okay, there's also the policy space around it, there's a financial space around it. And without tackling these issues, you can't get the enterprises any further than a certain glass ceiling, basically. And one of the key problems that we are always approaching, we're always facing, is this what we call missing middle financing gap, which you're probably all aware of. So there is quite a bit of financing available for the very small enterprise or for the micro entrepreneurs via etc. And then there's capital available for the larger enterprises or larger businesses. But what is really lacking is the sort of like small, medium sized enterprise financing or the small, medium capital. And that's exactly the space where we are active in, basically. I did want to go into detail why this capital is lacking, and I think all of you probably have ideas about that already. What I want to show with this slide I'm also sharing at the moment is there is a huge range of challenges related to climate financing for enterprises, like enterprise finance in general, and some of these aspects, which you can see at the top, are sort of like problems for all sort of like small and medium-sized enterprises, whereas others are more specific to the world of climate-related or eco-inclusive enterprises, which are the ones that have this tiny little green leaf on the side. And when looking at all these different challenges that enterprises, or that not only enterprises but also face when it comes to enterprise financing, we do see that all of these dimensions have like two sides, basically. On the one side, they're the challenges for the demand side, so for the SMEs, and on the other side, they're the challenges for the supply side. And this whole topic and this whole like complex framing is the reason why we do the Practitioner Labs Climate Finance. What we want to do with that is that we engage different players from the financial sector in a certain country or in a certain region, bring these together. So really multidisciplinary players, all from the financial sector side, basically, and bring these together in a multi-stage process. In this multi-stage design process, which is very much inspired by prototyping technologies, design thinking methodologies, we aim to get different players with different capacities and different qualities, different experiences together to together innovate and develop new financial products or new mechanisms for climate financing or for SME financing, basically, or inclusive SME financing, basically. And the idea really is that we mobilize a community, we bring together people, we connect people, but at the same time really get to tangible results at the end. And we think we can only reach that if we bring together different perspectives. So really have the investors, the financiers there, as well as like financial consultants, as well as other stakeholders that do sort of play a role in this whole space. We have been running these Practitioner Labs Climate Financing now for 4 years in 6 countries. And so far, I think we had 8 cycles, if I'm not mistaken. So in Thailand and Uganda, I think we had two cycles each. And then we had 1 cycle in Ghana, India, Indonesia, and South Africa each. So quite a widespread in terms of like regions, in terms of like how developed the financial sectors are in these regions. So that also gives us a bit of a breadth in our experience that we have there. What is the process for this? It's all inspired by design thinking and prototyping methodologies. That's kind of the core of what it is: co-creation, collaboration, in order to reach these results. So we do start with a bit of a challenge identification process, where we go to that market. We do a bit of a scoping. What are the key challenges with regards to eco-inclusive enterprise financing in that market? We try to identify key players in that market, or some of the key players, some interesting players, and ask them whether they would be interested in such a process. Together with these key players, we then try to figure out what are specific challenges in that space. Once we have like, let's say 3, 4, 5 challenges identified, we then invite other possible participants who would be relevant for each of these select challenges, for each of these like challenge groups that are hosted by one other organization we are working with, one of these key players that I mentioned before, and then we go through the design process. In a first kickoff lab, which would be a multi-day, ideally in person, current days, sometimes also digital lab setting, we bring these people together. We use different methodologies, prototyping methodologies, and do the ideation and prototyping kickoff, basically. Then after that, there are a couple of months with individual advisory work that we provide, but mostly let those groups in their group settings work offline together in whatever methodology works for them, but let them sort of refine what they've done in this kickoff lab, and then bring everyone back together in a scale-up lab setting, where this is like really about like finalization, further refinement of the idea, of the prototype, of a financial product or financial mechanism that they have developed so far, and bring it to a pitch-ready format. And the final thing that is happening at the Scale-Up Lab is also a pitch contest, a pitching possibility where the participants can pitch it to further investors and further stakeholders that might have an interest in like pushing the ideal outcome, which is in the fifth step, basically the rollout and getting this mechanism or new product, new idea to the market. Just as a quick glimpse for you, we basically work, I would just want to share a typical example of like what these like sort of prototyping tools look like. It's usually pen and paper. We stand in a room, we work with like different prototyping tools and different posters. This would be one of the templates where the ideas of such a prototype are being collected around, okay, what's actually innovative about what you're doing there? What would be the target market? What money are we talking about? What would be the timeline? These sort of like elements, typical, I think, blueprinting, prototyping, design thinking elements. Just wanted to share that briefly. What do we see as the key outputs then of such a process? I mean, firstly, there is obviously the sort of like development of a pitch, or not a pitch, only a high level, the prototype of such a financial product or mechanism, and we provide the support there. And there's also the visibility aspect, which is attractive to the participants. There are expert insights that we can loop in because you bring in people with different insights, different expertise areas, and bring all of these together. And as such, participants can benefit from that element. And then there's obviously one of the most important aspects, the network building. Again, not going into details here, but really just getting the idea of what we mean as opportunities to innovate. So there are lots of different ways how such innovate or what such innovation could look like, basically. And most of these innovations, most of these products, these mechanisms that come out of the labs have three main components that sort of characterize them. The one would be each of them use one or two actual financial instruments or mechanisms. So that could be debt, equity, it could be hybrid, it could be grant-based. All of these mechanisms would be like legit for these prototypes or pilots that we are looking for. Then there would be certain features. What does this element, this pilot, this prototype that we are developing here, that we are seeing there, what specific feature does it have? So usually the innovation sits in one of the features. And then as a final third step or stage, we would have the certain partners or the implementing partners, stakeholders that are involved in this mechanism. So that would be how what a prototype would look like. Basically, what are the elements? And sort of as a last thing, I would like to briefly just share with you some very brief examples, more as a bit of an overview of what such solutions could look like. I mean, as Anja said in the beginning, actually the number was right. 26 climate finance solutions have been developed over the past years. We ran these in 6 countries, as I said, 4 years. And the sort of the range of products there is huge. It ranges from data bundling that can then be accessed by banks to facilitate loan processes. It can also be the bundling on the demand side. That's what we've seen a couple of times. And one that I found actually quite interesting, and that's why I want to go a bit more into that, would be the one from Thailand a couple of years ago called Wild Chain, where we had the challenge, okay, not enough money is basically flowing into biodiversity protection and conservation services, and it's very hard to actually channel money into that space. So the group that was working on that challenge developed a gamified blockchain-based conservation platform. So basically a computer game or where you could play with different animals, and it was integrated in this whole app, in this whole game, that you could buy these animals, and by buying an animal, you would actually spend money on protecting the real animals out there. And so I just liked that, because that was so sort of like out of the box, and so different from what we had expected and what we had seen before. Yeah, I don't want to go into really the details now of like how that worked, but just to show you a bit like how exotic these examples can sometimes be, basically just to facilitate finance flows into the world of eco-inclusive entrepreneurship and into climate protection. So that would be it from my side as an input. Happy to share more on each of the topics or each of the elements that I spoke about, depending on what you're interested in.
Thank you so much, Jonas. These are the moments I really enjoy my work, I must say. I really feel a sense of gratitude, and it feels almost like a luxury that we are able to sit here and listen to your wonderful presentation, which, you know, is really right to the point and the questions that we are struggling with at the moment. And it shows that you have you thought about many of the things that we are trying to answer, many of the questions that we are trying to answer with the Transformative Finance Lab that we are trying to build. So thank you so much for that. I also like the one on the gamified blockchain-based conservation platform, and where you buy some animals. Maybe we can do this for plants as well, or really wonderful. Yes, do you want to close the presentation? Maybe then
Sure.
we can see each other.
Yeah, perfect.
Their way. And are you able to share the presentation afterwards? Can we put it on our website? Yeah.
Sure, I can do that.
That would be really nice to have this on the website.
Yeah.
Let me just start with the overall question. So when you have done such a lab, how do you know that a lab process has been successful?
Well, I guess there are really two dimensions to it, I would say. I mean, the one element, how you know that a lab process has been successful, is when you see actually some of these prototypes surviving, and when you see not necessarily that particular prototype being on the market straight away, but really more the ideas that have been developed, that they are being integrated in actual work that is happening afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think one has to be realistic about like what expectations can be, and the expectations are not very realistic that within 1 year you necessarily develop 5 new financial products that nobody had thought about in the past and that are ready to roll out after the process. That's just not realistic. I guess that's fair here. So I think success would really be like if these prototype developments have influenced the way work is done in the space of climate financing or financing, basically.
So that means if you very specifically, for example, if a financial institution adapts a certain idea and makes it includes it in its product offering as a bank, for example, or
exactly.
If a startup on this gamification platform is successful and survives after 3 years of operation.
I think that's what I would say, how I would define success. I mean, again, it highly depends on what prototype you're actually looking at. Like, take the example of this gamified approach. That was actually a product in itself. So basically there, it was pretty clear, either this product happens or it doesn't happen. And it was sort of like ready for market. And yes, it could also be positive if others adapt the idea and if others take the idea and develop
other sectors, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
We would be happy as well. But there it was actually super realistic that this is ready for the market. But then there are other mechanisms, and I tried to put it into context a bit. There are other sectors, other mechanisms, other prototypes where it's really much more about a certain feature that has been bundled with another feature, and that's what makes it new. And in these cases, I think I personally would already be happy if that's sort of like kickstarts a process of rethinking how stuff is done, how financing is done by different banks or by different investors. And then it doesn't necessarily have to be that particular prototype that has been developed, but the ideas in there, these elements that I showed on this like big green, blue, and red wheel, that is like what I would take as a success indicator.
And that's really an interesting way of looking at it. So now we talk about those successful cases. I assume the ones that you presented are the ones that are probably survived, and maybe there are some that haven't survived in any way, or where you would say these have been almost failures. I mean, if you do prototyping, if you design thinking, you have to expect that maybe out of the 10 solutions that you propose in such a lab, maybe only one survives, or maybe even none survives. Have there been some examples of where you say these were real failures, and what's the proportion of the failures, things that didn't come through?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so definitely there have been. It's quite hard to point to one or two and say like, oh, this has been a massive failure. It's also a question of like, what is actually a failure? I mean,
exactly, yeah.
It can also be a win if you realize this or that doesn't work, or this or that does not have potential. I mean, that's also in a way not a failure, but that's like failing forward in a way. So what I would also not say that all of the ones that were on my slide were necessarily the ones that have survived. That's not the case, but those are some of them do, some of them don't survive. But it's like, I think those are the most interesting ideas I felt, or some of the most interesting ideas, and they show sort of the range of what has come out. When it comes to the, as we call it, failures, then the ones that definitely don't survive, that probably already like briefly after the end of the lab trickle down, so and you realize, okay, there's not much happening there. Then in many cases it's because there is a driving force missing. So I think in only very few cases it's really that the idea isn't doable or doesn't have any potential. In many cases it's that sort of the energy in the groups gets lost at some point. If like the one or two main drivers drop out, sometimes it's even like one person who changes the employer, who gets a new job and then is no longer involved. Like there can be a range of topics, and sometimes it's as easy as they would need financing for their prototype to happen, and they don't find financing, and that's where it then ends. But the range of reasons is huge. why something doesn't work.
And I would have expected that you would argue, given that you showed the importance also of the networking and the peer learning, they cannot be a complete failure in any way, because these connections will remain in place, and who knows what will come out of it. And the experience that people have of being involved in such a process is something that may play out in the future in a completely different way. So it's
100%. It's actually like, I don't know whether you remember, I started actually when we spoke about like, how do I define success? I said there are two pillars, and we only spoke about the one pillar, which are the prototypes themselves. And the other pillar for me is exactly what you just mentioned, the networking part, and is sort of the community of practice that you develop through the Practitioner Labs climate financing. And for me, if I realize there is engagement between different players, then that would be success of the PLCF as well. And I think we just have to be careful what level we are looking at. Like, if we're looking at the success of the PLCF, then as I said, there are these two pillars. The most important part probably is the networking part. That's what we have to deliver, and that's what is really, if that doesn't happen, then it would have failed a certain PLCF, I'd say. But that always has been successful in what we have seen. And the second part is almost a top-on element. If any of these prototypes are really successful that come out of it, then that would be a very positive result of, or that is a very positive result of a PLCF. And when I now spoke of like failed prototypes, I was not speaking of like failed labs, but failed prototypes. Like within each lab, you would have like 5 or 6 prototypes, obviously in an ideal case scenario. But so we have to differentiate between like success or failure of a certain prototype and success or failure of a lab.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Good to make this different. Yeah, Linda. Sorry, I can see you need to leave, but you asked this. Do you still have 1 minute so we can ask Jonas about your question about the countries, how they are selected? Do you want to ask that question?
Yes, maybe 2 minutes because I have to leave, and I'm very sorry for that. But yes, my question was how the countries.
Maybe you can introduce yourself first so that you.
Sorry. Yes, I'm Linda Celeste from ADA in Luxembourg. We are an NGO involved in inclusive finance in different countries, in developing countries, and yes. We will be interested in yes, how you selected your countries, because your process is very interesting, and we would like to know how to be also maybe involved in your initiatives, and because these countries are not our focused countries, so maybe you plan to.
Maybe we can expand it a little bit to your countries. I assume there are more French-speaking countries, and
yes, or yes,
West Africa.
West Africa, but also in Asia, so Southeast Asia and Central America. So it's large.
I leave it to you to connect afterwards. Maybe you can get Adelphi's assistance to set up such a lab process in another country where you are active.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, I can briefly respond to the country question, like how are these selected, because the answer is quite straightforward. So generally, the process and the methodology would be open, I think, to most countries out there, as long as there is a financial sector to start with, so players to bring together. In most countries that we're usually working, and that is the case, that you have a sufficient sector that you could work with. And I think it's also less attractive if the sector is already like fully developed at full scale. And if you're looking at industrialized countries, it's sometimes not as exciting to find these like spaces for innovation. So I guess somewhere in between is the sweet spot. That's the one side. The other side is we've been working in countries where we have other activities as well. So where we are well sort of connected, where we have funding from our donors, from our sort of like clients, to do work in, where our project is based, and that's how we have selected the countries, and then looked at sort of like windows of opportunity when it comes to timing, but generally that's how the selection has worked. Obviously, the whole concept would be open to other places as well if there is interest from anyone to work on that and bring these things together, the methodology plus a local network that someone else might have in a certain place.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So, Linda, you have to leave now.
Yes. So bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for attending. And then, maybe see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Jonas, actually, talking about your partners and the way you select the countries, actually, so the main question that we are trying to get our head around is really the process, how you convene people. I assume you bring together a lot of people, and you need to have that convening power in a country, and that seems quite important. And then that related to that, maybe also the question, how you describe the way you come up with the challenges by walking around and seeing what the challenges are in the process. Is there also a way, a link between those who you partner with for running these labs and the kind of financing challenge that you select? And the fact that, have you also considered starting the lab process with co-sensing about the financing challenges? That's something that we are considering. Where do you start with the lab process? Do you start with the identified challenge, or do you need to do you want to involve different stakeholders to have a systems perspective on what the most important financing challenges are? Long question.
Yeah, long question, but I think it's I think it's straight to the point in a way. Where do we start? So we are in a balancing act between the methodological purity of design thinking, where you would start very much bottom up with looking at the entire sector and then like filtering it and really identifying the most important aspects by speaking to lots of different people on the one side and pragmatism on the other side. And I think we go for the first stage, we go down a bit more the pragmatic route, which means we really try to identify a couple of really interesting key players that also we feel have the energy and motivation to drive things forward in that country or in that region. We speak to them and we listen to them, what their preferences are, what they are working on, what they are interested in, where they have like a challenge that they are faced with. And then that could be one of the challenges. So we never say we are tackling the 4 most challenges in that market, but we say we tackle 4 relevant challenges in that market. And that is then very much based on the so-called challenge hosts or the so-called driving forces in these groups, and what they are actually looking for and that what they are interested in. Because if you don't sort of like have a topic or a challenge that a leading player is interested in, then I don't think there's any future in such a short time frame to develop something meaningful. And then, so that's the first part. How do we get to the challenge? We then usually discuss. Normally, they have very vague ideas what they are interested in, and we help them then together in conversations, sometimes also looping in other experts, in getting a bit more tangible challenges that really open a window for innovation and open a window for solution development. But that would be a process where we try to give advice, but it should come generally from the challenge host to identify the initial scope.
And typically, typically the challenge host would be a donor or a financial institution?
No, that would already be one of the participants in the group. So that would usually be, let's say, an investor. It could be a bank. It could be any player in the financial sector, but it wouldn't be someone from government. Definitely not, I'd say. And it wouldn't be someone who's overly big. So it's if it's like a bigger organization, then it would usually be a certain section of that organization that actually have this drive or the interest to be part of this solution development, because the challenge host is an active or needs to be an active part of the solution developing group. So they have to have someone with commitment in the group to develop something. That's not a donor. Yeah.
But the government, could they not be in there? I mean, there are promotional banks, locally development banks that are government owned. Or do you mean like at the policy level? You don't want to have anybody to host a challenge?
So what I meant, what we don't want probably would be someone, or what we try to avoid would probably be someone from the policy level, because then we would think that it's a bit of a muddling then between is it now policy or is it like tangible
interesting
product? So we really want to focus much more on the product side and not go down the policy route. That's what we have the policy lab for.
Yes. Is that why you created the policy lab? Is that because you felt that the process was not tailored to their needs, or not able to cover what the government and the policymakers would need?
In a way, I would put it differently. We realized the same process would also work for them. So
okay, no, I see it, but it still needs a dedicated process with clearly defined challenges that are suitable to meet their needs rather than the financial or the financial market needs. Okay, interesting.
Because on the financial side, we really try to get out tangible prototypes, and then it would be very difficult to mix that with normally a bit less tangible policy discussions that happen around it. If you really want to have a pragmatic, tailored conversation towards a financial instrument or a financial product or mechanism, that just doesn't really work together perfectly. And if you have another setup where you are a bit more open and where you are a bit more open to different policy conversations and discussions, then that works much better also in terms of bringing the right participants together. And that would then lead me also to my answer to the other part of your question, like how do we mobilize the participants, which is probably the hardest part of each lab, as you can probably imagine. A lot of it comes via snowball systems. So a lot comes via actually also talking to the challenge hosts, and they bring along some people they can think of. And and with each person you recruit, you try to tap into their networks as well. So you really try to create the spider web in a way. And at the same time, obviously, you also do the typical cold acquisition, basically, that you reach out widely. You try to just identify the most relevant player, convince them with arguments and with like just showing them what a great opportunity that is, what you're offering there. And many times it works, sometimes it doesn't. And yeah, and then often you can obviously also build on your own networks that you already have in a certain country. I mean, I guess it has to be a mix. You shouldn't limit it only to your own networks, because then the level of innovation might be limited. But you have to find the right balance again between being pragmatic and using who you already know, but then also being open to bringing together many different players and profiles in there.
Interesting. Yes. So I've been asking so many questions, Peter. I'm sure you have a lot of other questions that we
just
can
a few.
ask. And we're, in a sense, we're lucky also because it's just the three of us. So it's
there's
just the two of us asking questions.
No, I mean, I suppose to just start from a very simple point, because I've got a couple of questions on the kind of practicalities, but I'd also just be interested. You mentioned you're on your 8th cycle now and in 6 different countries. I mean, what's the biggest kind of difference between cycle 1 and cycle 8? Or what's the real changes that you've kind of had to put in place?
So I think there have been a couple of methodological tweaks, obviously, and a lot of learnings. A lot of learnings in terms of expectations. I think whereas in the beginning we started much more with this expectation of we run this process, and in the end we want to have this like market-ready product. Learned sort of like, okay, maybe you have to focus a bit more on the innovation process rather than the innovation outcome only. I think that has been an important learning, and that has also been a bit of a difference probably between the approaches. And as such, and it's sort of like part of the same point, we've also involved a bit more input from our side, like input as in training elements almost. So people come together, people are interested in this topic, but not necessarily know the details of what it actually means to finance climate smart SMEs, what it means to finance equally inclusive enterprises, and are very interested in that topic. So there is quite a demand amongst participants to learn something about it, even though we had in mind something much more, something that is much more focused on the pure design process and the innovation process. We realized there's a demand for certain elements where we could also give inputs and go away from this minimal approach with only offering an open design space. So now we have these sessions and slots here and there where we also provide these inputs or bring in experts and let them provide some inputs, being a bit more open in terms of the formats that we use. I think that would be two main differences. And then I guess methodologically speaking, it just gets better every year because you learn what methodologies work less good and which ones work better. It's like, yeah, I think that's normal.
Yeah, no, I think, and so that training piece is quite interesting, because we've had conversations about how you kind of start everyone from the same, because to your point about having an open design space, you kind of have to assume a kind of common level of knowledge or understanding or some form of common piece. And so when you're providing those training services, are those training opportunities to people, are those people that go through that training and then join the lab as proactive members, or are they people that turn up and learn about the issue and kind of, or the area and go away?
No, it would be meant for the ones that are actually joining. Yeah. So I guess it would. I wouldn't see it though as something they need to be all on the same level, because that wouldn't be realistic that you can actually achieve that. What it is much more is that this also creates a bit of a benefit, I think. Like, I mean, people are just really interested in it, and if they see that as an additional benefit on top of all the other benefits they already have from joining, and that can also create a sense of, oh, I really want to be part of that. Oh, I go home with something tangible that I can see, and not only I've spoken for 8 hours about the design of a new mechanism. So I think that's sort of also where it's coming from. It is, for us, it's much more a tool of mobilizing people, of bringing the idea forward, and is then also in line with what I said. It's about the process, not only about the outcome of the product. I mean, if that helps to sort of like plant the idea of how important and how feasible and how productive the climate financing can be, then great. I mean, that's what we want to get out of it in the end, right? So if that helps to put in these elements, then let's do it.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I hadn't given that any thought whatsoever. That's why this research process is great, because someone else has done all the hard work, and then you just suddenly go, oh yeah, good idea. But there is an element there that we haven't, I don't think I'd really thought about in the Transformative Finance Lab, where you're also providing value for people to be able to explain to other people why they're doing this as well. There's a kind of conversation for people, if you're taking people from organizations and away from other places, to be able to go back internally and go, well, I'm learning about this as well. It's not just, as you say, 8 hours in there. And then a really stupid question, possibly, so apologies if it is, what's the economic model behind the labs? I mean, are you fully funded to offer the labs? Is there a participant cost? And how's that kind of driven, and are there kind of trade-offs made in return for that kind of funding? Or
so I'd say the investment that participants put in is the participation, but because, as you rightly said, they are investing time, they are investing paid time by their employers. So that is the commitment from the participants. There's no fee to join. There's no other costs involved whatsoever. And I think that's also important. We are fully funded to run the process. We are not funded. And I think there are also very good reasons for that. And I think I would also not necessarily support it too much to put in the financing straight away for these prototypes. I think there are reasons why it can be good to split these processes, to have someone for the design phase and then others to look into financing those models if they are convincing. So the economic model for us is we are getting paid for running these prototypes, not prototypes, the labs, the PLCFs, and then participants join with their own time. They pay for their own travels. And they pay for their own accommodation. It is all not being paid for, because you don't want to force people to come. You don't want to put too many incentives to come. You want people at the table who really want to be there. And then whether they get financing or not is a bit out of our hands. We help them with the pitching. We help them with like how to approach finances, but that would be a separate challenge for them. And I think like if a model is convincing, then getting access to finance can also be feasible on that basis.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I did have another quick question on that. Is how do you manage? I mean, because on the one hand, there's getting people engaged for that process, and it is a big commitment. They're going to put time in, accommodation. But I also wondered how you kind of end the engagement as well, because when looking on the website and such, you're dealing with things that yes, in an ideal world, they'll come together, then they'll get a prototype, and then they'll off and go and find finance. But do you have struggles with ending the engagement? Do you keep in touch with them as it goes on, or how does that kind of relationship bit work for you guys?
So I think that's one of the parts where we have also evolved, or where our approach has also sort of like evolved over time. In the beginning, it was quite hard to put where is that end, like how much, as long as we see potential for them to be connected to investors, we put work in. That was the approach in the beginning. But once you have like one cycle or 2 cycles per year, and it suddenly adds up if you keep being in touch with all of them. And also, I think there is a point where you have to say like, let them run. And if it works, then it will work. And if it doesn't work, then it won't. So you basically, at some point, we defined clear endpoints where we said, okay, we help you with final communication piece, with this final pitch piece, where we give you inputs, where we provide advisory on what would a good outcome on paper look like as a documented form. And once that documented form is done, we say that would be the end of our support. If there is anything specific people want to support with, or a connection they want in future, then obviously we were always happy to help, but not in a proactive manner that we call them up every week. And obviously, we try to touch base every now and then with previous challenge hosts or previous challenge groups or prototype owners, and see like how they are doing. But we think we have to end the active support at some point. So we are putting over time we've learned to put a bit of an end date there.
Yeah, I think that's the piece that you don't want to seem like harsh or anything, but how you end that is I think often tough, because we always see another little bit of hope around the corner, and the people involved in these projects are always sure it's going to work just next week. So there's a real challenge in that. I do have one or two other questions, but Anya, are you I'm in danger of taking over.
Of course, I can ask a lot of questions until this evening, but I guess Jonas also wants to leave. I would have another question on the engagement and how to keep people engaged, because it seems quite a long process, but it depends on what your question is about. Okay. And talking about the economic model earlier, where you said no fees because already they put a lot of investment in terms of the time, but we also know that sometimes when you pay for something, then people value it more, and then they make the commitment to stay on board because they have paid for something. I mean, generally, I wonder, the overall question is really about how do you manage to keep people engaged and spend their time on something that seems like quite a long process, huh? Can you give a bit of an idea about how often these product development groups meet and how much time is involved, and then in which way you incentivize people to remain committed to their group and provide the inputs?
Or even, and if I may just slightly add to that, and do you actually, have you had experiences where people obviously do drop off with commitment? How do you deal with that, or do you kick them out, or that kind of thing? See, we're getting good. Our questions go together now.
So we don't kick people actively out. But okay, maybe the timeline isn't helpful. What a cycle actually, how long a cycle takes. So usually, I would say the kickoff lab would happen somewhere between March and April, maybe in a year, and then the scale-up lab would happen, or transition lab, however you want to call it, would happen somewhere between October, November, end of the year. So you would look at something like an active involvement of people of 9 months, maybe something like that, up to 9 months. Maximum 1 year, but between the two labs, it shouldn't be much more, I would suggest, of 4 or 5, maximum 6 months, I'd say, would be sort of like the maximum time that you should have really between the two labs. Otherwise you lose momentum, because obviously, and you already asked the right question, obviously it's very hard to keep people on board if you don't have any physical meetings in between. I mean, you have this kickoff lab, it's very easy, but it's the easiest part to get people engaged for that, because that sounds exciting. People come, and that's where you create the initial momentum and the kickstart. Then you have these meetings in between. Those are probably the hardest ones to keep people on board, because there's no event to it, right? It's more like it's a working group. And usually I'd say maybe 2-3 meetings between the two labs happen, and then there's a bit of homework everyone does, but that's really on the groups. Some groups meet very regularly, and some other groups meet only twice between the two labs, and do much more homework individually, and they split the work somehow and do it. But I think it's important that they do at least meet twice in between. Ideally a bit more, but that depends really on the groups. And then for the scale-up lab, you would usually have slightly smaller groups in the beginning, or for the transition lab, changed name over time. You would have slightly smaller groups than in the beginning, because only those stay that really still see a benefit in the business opportunity for themselves. I think that is also intentional. So you don't want to have people in a group that won't play an active role in the mechanism or the product itself. So I think losing people is part of the process. And again, it's not a failure. It's like you don't beat a dead horse. It doesn't make sense to keep people on board that have no stakes in that model whatsoever, in that mechanism. So keep the ones that want to be active and that see a business opportunity. I think that's in the interest of everyone. And yeah, sometimes we even had like the working groups in between in small, very active, very productive groups, and then invited the others back to the scale-up lab because we thought like, okay, it's nice for them to come back and see where this was all going in a bit more public space than maybe. But yeah, these have been different ways of dealing with that. But usually those that have a real interest and those that you really want to have at the table will stay if they're developing something meaningful.
Okay. Really interesting. And my last question would also be about the financing then. So if I just imagine the product development group is consists of some people from some financial institutions, maybe then you may have someone from an NGO, I don't know, or whatever, or entrepreneur, I have no idea. Would then the organizations where people work, would they be interested in sponsoring and supporting an instrument? So is some of the prototypes and the products that you developed, are they then co-sponsored by the organizations where the people in the working groups work with, or is that completely separate?
You know, I mean, that's obviously an option. I mean, there wouldn't be a sponsoring agreement, an official one or something, but people join because their organization thinks that this could be a nice addition to their portfolio.
Yeah, but could it also be that you end up teaming up with your competitor because they all both see a market opportunity, and then you say, oh, let's offer this jointly? Is that something that has happened in the past? Because I assume there are some competitors in the same room, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Of course, sometimes there are. I think you have to be careful about that. Sometimes if they actively choose to work together, then it's cool. But you wouldn't want to place them without consulting them at the same table, because then that might just hinder innovation because they don't want to share their ideas, obviously. Has that happened in the past? I'm struggling to really give you an answer there. I don't think that we had an example where two actual competitors have teamed up together to develop something jointly. I could see that as an option, but I don't think it has happened because usually because of the multidisciplinarity of the groups, that's usually something that doesn't really happen, because you would have, if you have like two players who are of the same format, you would try to bring them into different groups to have each group as a multidisciplinary group. That's why probably rather not, but that two different organizations chip in resources to develop this together or bring this to life together. Yes, that.
And so just very, very briefly then, just on that, the curation of the groups, when you're looking to try and bring these groups together, as you start with the first kind of session, is that just a kind of best you can do? So, not in a bad way, but you look at it and go, this looks like this should work if we put these guys on the table, they have multidisciplinary, and then you just leave that and let natural progress from there, prescriptive in putting those.
It's a bit of a mix. So it's a bit of a mix that we speak to all potential participants or try to communicate with them to figure out what they're actually interested in. We usually recruit them specifically for a specific challenge together with the challenge host. So it's not that they come necessarily to an open room and then there are like 5 different challenges and they choose what they want to work on. Very often we recruit them for a specific group already. Sometimes obviously there is then scope for swapping between groups. So sometimes there is obviously also space for people to choose where they feel they can add the most value. So there is migration between groups. But a bit of it is decided, or a bit of it is discussed or figured out together with the challenge host, together with the participant, together with us, sort of what might work best. We had already tried as well that we only spoke to the challenge hosts, put them at tables, and then people entered the room and sat at that group that they found most interesting. But that has caused some challenges as well, obviously, because then you have like one group with 11 members and another group with 3, and so you have to be a bit more, I think, specific and targeted in your approach for mobilizing.
But maybe that's the law of 2 feet, huh? That's,
True.
Then walk to what attracts most of their attention. Huh? Maybe that's also part of the innovation process, that already some ideas die early where they don't get the right support that they would need to continue.
I do that.
But it's an interesting question, huh? To ensure on the one hand being prescriptive, and on the other end to ensure balance and diversity, and on the other hand leaving it to the participants to choose where they want to spend their time, huh? And who looks more nicer or
shinier,
friendly. Wonderful, Jonas. I'm afraid we have to end the conversation, but it was really such a great pleasure to talk to you, and really so many new insights that we gained, isn't it, Peter? I really enjoyed the conversation, and if we may, maybe we come back to you on some specific questions, and please keep involved. We're going to have this design workshop in April or May. We have to yet to set the date, so that would be a possibility also for you to engage and share your experience and guide us a little bit through the process. I do hope that you will engage, and also that later when we have actually run these labs, we'll have them on different topics. One of them will be education first, but then there are all sorts of topics that are possible, including actually on climate, or on more on the green side, or sustainability, biodiversity. I love that topic. You know, I think it's really interesting because it's so hard to get funding in. So all these topics also where I think you have a lot of expertise and experience, and so it would be wonderful if you could continue to engage with us on that.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks so much for inviting me, and definitely very keen to stay involved. And if you have any questions at some point later on, feel free to reach out again. Yeah, very happy to provide further experiences. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Very much.